Welcome to On the Ballot with Ballotpedia, where we take a closer look at the top political stories of the day. Ballotpedia connects people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed. I'm Victoria Rose, and thanks for being with us. We're back with our final installment of our RCV Explained series, taking a deep dive into ranked choice voting. As the policy gains more attention and more ballot measures and bills aim to either expand, limit, or ban RCV, we're here with everything you need to know: what RCV is, how it works, its track record, the arguments in favor and against, and where it's headed in 2024. Today, we're going to look at RCV from a more academic perspective, exploring its history, defining its different variations, delving into some data and research. Here to help us get into the weeds is Jack Santucci, a lecturer of political science at Queens College, City University of New York. Jack holds a PhD in government from Georgetown University, and his research revolves around electoral systems and reform, proportional representation, and the many different variations of ranked choice voting. His book, More Parties or No Parties: The Politics of Electoral Reform in America, came out late last year. Jack, thanks for coming on the show.
Hi, Victoria.
We're excited to have you on here. We've had a couple of other episodes where we discussed pro and opposition arguments on RCV, but we have you as our academic expert on RCV, and I'm excited for this conversation. To start, why did you decide to focus in on electoral reform, but RCV specifically for your research?
Well, like many young people, I was interested in proportional representation. And like many young people, I thought that to get to multi-party democracy, you need proportional representation. That's nearly 20 years ago. But we knew about these instances of the single transferable vote, or what's now being called proportional ranked choice voting, which were in place in 22 legit cities. And when you read the literature on why those were repealed, when you read it closely, you start to find that the sort of conventional wisdom doesn't really add up. Once you start studying political science, the conventional wisdom out there is that Black Americans and communists got elected in a couple of places, and that's the reason all of this stuff disappeared. So when it came time to write a dissertation in graduate school, I said, I'd really like to get to the bottom of what those repeals were about, using some of the stuff that I've been learning about American politics and comparative political institutions. And I'm sure we'll get into that. But then learning about proportional ranked choice voting, the single transferable vote, got me into learning about all the other RCV that was out there. It was all connected.
Yeah, we're going to get into all the different forms, but kind of going off of your answer, can we go over the origin story of RCV? It's been around for over 150 years and then had a resurgence in the Progressive era and New Deal era. So going back to 1850, how did it find its footing? And then why did it see a resurgence during that Progressive and New Deal eras?
Yeah, so you got to go to Western Europe, in the wake of the revolutions of the first half of the 19th century. And democracies are emerging. These countries are not fully democratic yet, but a lot of them have multi-seat districts. And as political parties are starting to emerge and get good at recruiting candidates, controlling nominations, running up voter turnout, they start to sort of sweep all of the seats in those multi-seat districts. So if you got a 3-seat district, the fear is that the Socialist Party is going to get all 3 of those seats. So you start to see all sorts of innovation in electoral system design. Other people earlier than the 1850s had sort of articulated the idea of proportional representation and articulated the party list version, which we could end up talking about. But it's in Denmark. A guy named Carl Andre writes it down, and it ends up being used for upper chamber elections there for a few decades. And then it's obviously independently invented in the United Kingdom by Thomas Hare, although there are other British type people who are thinking about it and coming up with different versions of it. So that's where the idea comes from, of the multi-winner proportional form. And then in the 1870s, either at Harvard or MIT, someone comes up with the single seat form, instant runoff, but he's not really coming up with it because there had been a whole bunch of other single winner electoral systems floating around. But what he really does is he applies the single transferable vote to a single seat election. And then we don't see it adopted anywhere in the United States until I think 1907, which is for internal party primaries in one of the states of the Pacific Northwest. Then in 1909, we see the instant runoff version adopted as part of what's known as the commission form of government in Grand Junction, Colorado. There's a whole story we could tell about that. Then, after the Great Republican Party split of 1912, that combination, the commission form of government with the sort of instant runoff form, something like the instant runoff form, just spreads like crazy all over the place because the party's messed up, needs some way to hold itself together, or maybe people want to just continue to tear it apart and they're using instant runoff to do that. And then the proportional representation people see all that activity and say, hey, maybe we can bend all of that activity to the adoption of proportional representation, which is where you get these single transferable vote adoptions beginning in 1915.
Got it. I appreciate all the animated history we got going on here. All the details you threw in there too. You explore the history of RCV in your latest book, More Parties or No Parties. You also argue that electoral reform is most likely in periods of party system instability. Why do you think that's the case?
Well, basically talking about the theory, the broader point had sort of been made by others in different ways that electoral reforms don't just come out of the sky. Someone's got to adopt them. You've got to put together a coalition to adopt one of these things. So what leads to the creation of a coalition for electoral reform? Well, some sort of either threat to an establishment or some widely shared belief within a replacement coalition that electoral reform can be used to sort of remove an establishment or change at least a portion of the political establishment. And all of that, I argued, becomes more likely during maybe periods of party realignment here in the United States, or if you go to Western Europe, when you sort of have the entry of new parties into the political system. Socialist parties and socialist clubs were the big catalyst for that. There's some evidence that that was the case in Latin America. Maybe if you have a rapid expansion of the electorate, that could change the sort of nature and substance of party competition, and that gets you back into a situation of instability. So there are all sorts of things that might destabilize a party system. And I think Trumpism has been an example of that in the United States. And then I said, well, okay, let's take a very simple model of how sort of parties work and why they form and apply it to the question of why do electoral systems get reformed. And I came up with 3 types of electoral reform. One is insulating. That's when the incumbent coalition, not just politicians, but, the folks that they talk to, the interest groups that they talk to, want to keep themselves in power. And that's probably the most common form of electoral system reform around the world. The second type I came up with was a realigning reform episode. And that was what we saw a ton of in the United States during the Progressive Era New Deal period. So that is when, for whatever reason, some portion of, so you've got incumbents and interest groups that are allied with them and a group of people who sort of vote for them. You get a realigning reform when sort of a portion of that party's or that coalition's voters are unhappy, and the interest groups that those voters tend to hang out with are unhappy, and therefore they are willing to work with the other side to stick it to their own party or their own coalition. And that's what I called a realigning reform. That's enough. I'll stop there for a second.
Wait, what about the third one? You said there were 3.
The third one was what I called a polarizing episode. And I sort of invented that to describe what was going on in a lot of the cities with the repeal of single transferable vote, which is say just, Republican and Democratic party leaders and opinion leaders and allied newspapers colluding with each other to get rid of these electoral institutions. I say it's a polarizing episode because the idea there is that you've got some faction in government that sort of refuses to choose sides. And perhaps they're making, this faction is making both sides of politics look foolish. So both sides of politics put aside their disagreements for a minute and say, yeah, let's get rid of this set of political institutions. And the other sort of case of that type of reform that I found was the repeal of PR in France in the late 1950s. You had a similar situation there. You had a left, you had a right. The right was sort of led by Charles de Gaulle. And then there were a whole bunch of center parties. And if you read the historical literature on that, right and left get on the phone with each other and say, let's get rid of these center parties.
And for our listeners, PR means proportional representation, just in case they didn't catch that acronym. My next question is, advocates of RCV say with enough education, it's easy to understand, and opponents say RCV is just too confusing for voters. Both perspectives are pretty easy to follow, but they almost overlook how many different types of RCV there are. And from your research, you've identified at least 10 different types of RCV. So can you highlight maybe like 3 to 5 of them and go over what makes them different?
Yeah, I think so. I think the simplest way to come at this is to think about RCV systems in sort of 2 big dimensions. One is, what are the mechanics of how it's allocating seats to winners? So you can try to get a majority winner in a single seat district. You can try to get majority and minority representation in a multi-seat district, or you can try to get a single party or a single slate to win every seat in a multi-seat district. So there's sort of 3 ways that gets you to sort of 3 types of RCV. Then it's helpful to think in terms of what it does to nominations. So it can be used within parties, against parties, or among parties. And it gets a lot more complicated than that. But what we're seeing in the United States, I think, is mostly instant runoff. Now in 2024, we're looking at a whole bunch of instant runoff against parties. We've seen some instant runoff within parties. And we're seeing some single transferable vote, which is majority and minority representation against parties. Although I don't think that the STV adoptions are as aggressively anti-party today as they were, say, a century ago. And that's largely because PR advocates are kind of stuck with nonpartisan elections, and they need a form of PR that will work with nonpartisan elections. So it's just the conversation about electoral systems and what they are and how they work in the United States, I think really has been defined. But most people's reference point by now is like ranked choice voting or approval voting. But I think it's a lot more helpful to use a sort of clean party list PR system as a reference point, right? And there, if a party gets 10% of votes, it gets 10% of seats. And once you understand that, it becomes easier to understand how the single transferable vote works. And I'm not going to try to explain that on this call because it's pretty hairy.
Where does like top 4, top 5 RCV fall in that spectrum of electoral reforms? How does that? Because I feel like that's one of the most common put forward on ballot measures across the country.
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of, so on the first dimension, it's let's use it to try to get a majority winner. And on the second dimension, let's use it against parties. The goal here is basically to split one or the other party in a given place, and put together some sort of new coalition. So I look at the landscape of where these things are coming up. I'm saying, are these realigning reform episodes that are being attempted, or are they insulating episodes that are being attempted? And I think this is crucial about everyone looks at Alaska and says, oh, it's a great thing because, it got Mary Peltola elected and it allowed Lisa Murkowski to do all sorts of stuff in Congress that she might not have done otherwise. And the thing about Alaska is that that state's political system was already organized. The coalition that sort of broadly controlled government there is basically the coalition that brought that Final Four system in. So to the extent that people think that coalition structure, a sort of moderate Republican who depends on the Democratic establishment for support, to the extent that people think that can be replicated in other places, I'm a little skeptical.
Comparing Alaska to Maine, which is the other state that uses RCV at this point, how does that political landscape compare to like the coalition that you're talking about in Alaska?
Yeah, once upon a time, I wrote a paper on Maine. And when you look at the data, Matt Grossman once described it as largely a Democratic Party action. I think what happened up there was the Democratic Party sort of made peace with the cause of instant runoff, which was sort of becoming RCV at that point, and passed it. And it is therefore used in party primaries. It is used among parties. So it's a within parties RCV. It's an among parties RCV for federal general elections. And I suspect that many local RCV activists back in 2016 really hoped that it would be used among parties to elect the governor, right? In other words, the Green Party can get in there and run a candidate, and then voters can do what we all thought RCV was for, 10 years ago, which is rank the Green Party candidate second, rank the Green Party candidate first, rank the Green Party Democrat second. So the sort of short answer is that in Maine, it was a project of the Democrats largely. There were some independent Republicans involved in it. And in Alaska, it was the project of a bipartisan coalition that already existed. I don't mean bipartisan in the sense that all Republicans went along with all Democrats, but you got large elements of both parties supporting it there.
That's really interesting, the two dichotomies in the states. Something that came up in our conversation with Trent England, who talked about the opposition to RCV, was the national popular vote, which is a form of electoral reform, and RCV, and kind of like how do those two things reconcile in a state like Maine that has both? I wonder what your take is on that.
I haven't thought all that deeply about it, but once upon a time, I remember conversations about how, using instant runoff or single winner RCV alongside national popular vote might make a difficult situation even harder for people to get around. What if we're dealing with, what do you do in a recount scenario under national popular vote plus instant runoff? My research and what I've read suggests that all of this RCV stuff takes a tremendous amount of political will to keep in place, to make work. You go to Ireland and Australia are the examples that everybody's look, it works there, we can do it here. But Ireland is a country of 4 million people, and Australia has a standing electoral commission whose job it is, it's their job to study how RCV is working and make it work better. There's like an RCV bureaucracy in Australia. Can we create one of those here? You probably would need one for an adoption on that scale.
That's interesting, especially in the international context of it all. Let's jump into your own personal research a little bit more. In one of your articles, you kind of talk about the generational divide on the perspective of RCV. So young voters are more likely to be in favor of RCV. Is that correct?
So those data suggested that, and all of those data, I think, were collected in 2016. Maybe some of those data and they were all surveys. One was a national survey, 2 or 3 more were from actual adoption campaigns. So in those data, it was a cause of young people, which sort of isn't surprising because that tends to be where you find that sort of pox on both their houses. I don't like this party system sentiment. It could look different now because there's been a lot of time and effort put into building support for RCV among older people and perhaps kind of Republicans whose party left them. So Final Five really wasn't much of a thing when Devin and I wrote the article you're talking about. The data could look different now, but the hunch we had was that, okay, so let's assume that this support for RCV among young people is a kind of anger at the system, let's burn it all down. And there was some evidence for that in the way that the Maine RCV was marketed. Jennifer Lawrence was brought in to make YouTube videos for this thing, and they were very sort of rage against the machine. That was the flavor of the video. So let's assume that is what's going on. One of the data sets allowed us to see if that millennial support for RCV was also correlated with opinions on the way that democracy works. And we found, yes, that's the case. And, I don't think those findings in isolation are enough to sort of say, oh, yeah, that's what this is all about. It's about young people who want to burn down the system. But when you take those findings and compare them to sort of what was going on during the progressive era and how people were talking about this stuff, the stories are consistent, right? There's anger out there and it's finding expression through electoral reform, and it concentrates among young people. So one of the great quotations from an old single transferable vote field operative. This guy he described himself as a Fabian socialist, but he clearly became cynical with his cause and his work, but he continued to sort of promote these things because that was his job. And he says something like, nobody understands this thing, but the same old remark that has done service in every other city manager campaign is heard on every side. nothing could be worse than what we've got. Any change is better than what we've got right now, which is an interesting attitude.
Yeah, interesting argument for the system, for sure. Another paper I found interesting from you, it talked about the language surrounding RCV and how that affects people's view of it. What did that research reveal when it comes to a voter's perspective on RCV?
Which paper are you talking about? Are you talking about stuff on ethnicity, perhaps? Or
Yeah, I think that's what it was.
So I haven't done too much on how people whose first language isn't English interact with an RCV ballot or feel about an RCV ballot. But this gets back to that whole confusion question. And opponents of RCV and RCV-based systems have said this is confusing for a really long time, partly because they don't like it. But then there's this other group out there that's like, well, in what way is it confusing? And from what I've seen and from a little research I've done with a couple of colleagues in the field of American politics, it looks like putting a large number of candidates in front of somebody and asking them to come up with a preference ordering is what generates a sort of negative reaction or a sort of get out of my face kind of reaction. And I wouldn't say that somebody is confused by what they're being asked to do. It's more that they just don't have the mental energy, don't feel like expending the mental energy to do those things. That said, I think there's some evidence, and we may see more of it coming out over time, that non-use of ranking or perhaps ballot error hits Latino communities harder than other communities. Communities perhaps whose first language isn't English get hit a little bit harder than other communities. Educational attainment is a persistent correlate of these types of outcomes. And then Australia, if you Google around and for invalid ballots, Australian election, right? And this is a country that's been using these rules for 103 years or something like that. The rate of ballot invalidity in a federal election there has just gone steadily upward for a couple of decades now. And it was quite high in some parts of the country that were heavily immigrant. And The Guardian, as I said, is the paper that has that story. So that's interesting, right? That suggests that maybe like you need persistent voter education. And it's not clear what the upper limit is on the amount of voter education you need.
Yeah, that makes sense. To close, we just finished up an election cycle, off-year election cycle. We're heading into 2024. RCV is gaining momentum. Do you think it'll continue to expand across states and localities? And then on the reverse of that, opposition is actually growing as well with states outlawing RCV. Do you think that will continue to grow as a movement as well?
The ban activity, the sort of preemption is what you would call in the state and local government literature preemption. It will depend on the outcomes of those ballot measures in 2024, right? Colorado, Nevada, Florida may have another one, Oregon, Arizona. So, if Republican establishments continue to see it as a threat, you're going to see more of that ban activity. And that's consistent with sort of what we saw during the progressive era. There was no single transferable vote in the Solid South. You're familiar with the Solid South. This is Dixie under the control of the Democratic Party during the progressive era. No single transferable vote, very little instant runoff type stuff, and much of it was within the Democratic Party for Democratic Party primaries. So that would be similar, right? If deep red states just ban this thing, that would be like deep blue states in the old days. But much depends on what happens with the ballot measures in 2024. And I haven't seen any polling. I don't know what's being done to put together reform coalitions for this stuff, but you need a majority of the folks who show up to vote to pass this stuff. One way to do it is to sort of ram it through in a low turnout election. But if that tool's not available, not every state is in Alaska. Not every reform is going to be an insulating episode.
Yeah, we saw that in Massachusetts with its defeat of ranked choice voting in 2020.
And there's an interesting thing about Massachusetts. Some of the grumbling I saw on the internet on Massachusetts was coming from people who were saying, we would like RCV, but not this version that uses it within a party primary. The reformers should come back with a version that allows us to dissolve the barriers between the parties. In other words, the reformers should come back with something that looks more like a Final Five.
It's surprising that they haven't come back in Massachusetts with another ballot initiative with ranked choice voting. At least in this upcoming 2024 election cycle, there will not be one. But yeah, that's all the questions I have for you. Thank you so much for coming on, sharing your expertise, all this history. It's great, valuable information for our listeners. And that's all for our RCV Explained series. Thanks to those of you who followed along. Listeners, be sure to check out the rest of the RCV Explained series if you missed it. We'll be back next week with another episode. I'm Victoria Rose, and thanks for listening.